am recording.
Excellent. So we are now on Machiavelli's The Prince, a shorter work compared to The City of God, The Republic, actually, and The Politics, much shorter. And we're doing 2 sessions on it, so breaking that work in 2 parts. I will say at the outset, I've read The Prince, but it was a while ago. And when we get into the Renaissance, which is where we are, Renaissance Florence, my grasp of what's going on historically is not as strong as other periods.
Mm-hmm.
And the reason I raise that, as you know, he makes a lot of historical references as he's making his overall point. So there's a little bit of weakness on that. I actually talked to my friend Luca, who is Italian and who did have sort of a good humanities education in Italy. He would join us on the call for a brief introduction of just the context of Renaissance Florence, but he couldn't. He wanted to, but he couldn't.
Mm-hmm.
Apple meetings, etc.
Gotcha.
But what I thought it would be interesting to start with is instead of we can go through it piece by piece, all that like we normally do. But I thought it might be interesting to pose a question and connecting it back to the Republic. So get a little intertextuality here.
Mm-hmm.
And specifically with the question of sort of connecting it back to Thrasymachus' definition of justice, which was that justice is the interest of the stronger. We actually think that with what we're reading in Machiavelli, we think that that is his working definition of justice.
Mm-hmm.
So from what you've read, how would you respond to that?
That's interesting. Yeah, so from what I've read, I feel like a lot of what he's describing is if you want to do this, then do this kind of thing.
Sure.
Like it's cause and effect of being a leader, being a prince. And in this sense, it's like very dictatorial. I mean, there's some instances of different governments mentioned, but when it comes to justice, that's a good question. So I guess in the sense that he promotes, I guess, like violence and overruling and those aspects to further one's kingdom and maintain their rule and power. Maybe
Right.
that would be considered just or justifying. I don't know. Like
Mm-hmm.
it's hard to determine. Like, what do you mean by like justice again? Like
Oh no,
like
justice would be. So to go back to Thrasymachus, justice, he is defining as justice as the interest of the stronger, meaning, in other words, what the stronger determines as law and as order and as right, right?
mm-hmm.
That would be the
Well,
just individual would follow the dictates of the one in power.
sure, sure.
That may be not your definition, maybe not mine.
No, no,
Not
no.
Plato.
I get you,
Okay.
but you're asking me to compare what he's written to that definition, right? And I don't necessarily
Yeah,
know
like in
his
other words.
motives.
Okay.
But
Okay.
like, so it like it's interesting. So, does he? Do I think he would use that definition in his works? From the prince's point of view, probably. Um,
Okay.
but like, it's hard to determine whether or not he's applying that to everyone because there are rebels and there are those people. Um,
But well, let's put it this way. Would it be the prince's working definition? Because obviously he's writing this almost as a guide for
yeah.
new prince.
Mm-hmm.
So for that individual, could we say, yeah, that what he's saying about the prince and what the prince should do and how the prince should operate, would that fall under the sort of umbrella definition of justice as the interest of the stronger? I guess that's another way of doing it. I mean, he doesn't seem to, at least overtly, say, hey, and by the way, this is what justice is, right? It's not sort of platonic discussion about the concept.
Yep.
But
I think that you could probably say that of the princes he's describing.
You think so?
Yeah, I think that works. I'm trying to find a counterexample, but I don't know if I can think of one.
Yeah. I mean, my sense too is I mean, there's so much talk about maintaining power.
Yes.
Right?
Mm-hmm.
There's so much talk about maintaining power that, and you know, it's interesting. It reminds me of, to sort of jump to another sphere or type of institution. It reminds me a bit of a sort of an international or national company within a capitalist regime, right?
Mm-hmm.
Where I mean, obviously the desire is to increase capital for the shareholders, right?
Mm-hmm.
But also not die. You don't want to. You know, the idea of making a company is not necessarily to create a company that you know is going to die, and you know, fall to pieces. This element of like the struggle for the company to stay alive, to stay relevant, to continue to make a profit. It's sort of analogously, the prince, as we've been reading it, seems like, or at least his ideal for the prince is to hold that position. Like, how do you hold that position? How do you continue to hold that position,
right,
and not lose it?
Mm-hmm.
Which is related. So going back to that definition, seems to be connected, right?
Mm-hmm.
You know, why do you want ultimately? Why does he want the prince to hold the position? He wants the prince to hold the position because, you know, I'm guessing at some level out of self-interest. There are all these like temporal benefits from holding power, right?
Mm-hmm.
So once you're doing everything that's sort of that he prescribed, one could argue like, okay, that is what justice is. Then it's what this individual says goes, and those who follow it are doing the just thing. I mean, that's sort of what I'm getting thus far, because he doesn't seem to have like at all a notion of justice, like it's this sort of lofty, ethereal definition, right?
Sure. Yeah, and that's interesting because it's like, whereas kind of the works that we've been looking at before this are really focused on how the individual contributes to society and the state. I mean, the Republic talked about um, the ruler, but it was more in the interest of the individual. Whereas this piece of
Oh,
work seems
totally.
to be, focusing on the ruler, and not necessarily regarding the interest of the people, except in maintaining that position of power, right? Because there's a lot of instances where it's like, there's situations where the people will rebel or they will, not be aligned with the prince, and the prince needs to
Mm-hmm.
combat that in a certain way. And there's some specifics that he gives, but it's like that's kind of like the only situation where he's really thinking about what the populace wants versus what the prince
Mm-hmm.
wants.
Yeah. No, I'm with you on that, and I would add to that as well. Like you're getting the like let's say that Thrasymachus' definition. Let's say that Thrasymachus was able to like fully develop the specifics of his definition, right?
Mm-hmm.
Because they're just dealing with in the Republic Book One, they're just dealing with this definition of justice. Thrasymachus, jumps in, gives his definition. But if you had to play it out in its details, it almost seems like this is what you get in the Prince, right? Because a lot of it's about tactics and strategies to hold on to that power,
Mm-hmm.
right? Like a rule book almost for ways to maintain it. You know, I mean, he does talk about sort of the origin of it, like how does the prince get it, right? He keeps on bringing up that the twofold concept of fortune and prowess. Right? So like there have to be favorable circumstances that bring about the opportunity to rule. Fortune. I don't think fortune is just a monetary concept. That could be included, right?
Mm-hmm.
But like favorable circumstances. And then the other side is strength. You know, the fortitude to stick with it, and push on will also enable you. And in that, I'm raising that because that he's not just sort of saying, "Hey, here's the prince. He's already an existing thing. Here are now tactics and rules for him to maintain the power." But he also does bring up how that prince will even come into being,
Mm-hmm.
right? And he does that too in his little list of Moses, Theseus, Cyrus, and Romulus, right? Of sort of talking about like how they came into power. So yeah, but clearly, I think it's safe to say that you've got no Platonic cities here, no sort of Augustinian cities of God,
Right.
at play. Although at some point we'll have to discuss, he does start to touch on the ecclesiastical principalities, which is sort of interesting.
Mm-hmm.
Like he has some stuff to say about religion, but clearly this is a counter move with what we just read with Augustine. You know, in other words, it seems like all of the traits of the city of man, in a way, maybe not all of them, but a lot of the traits of the city of man, which would be considered vices, Augustine, are actually now considered virtues by Machiavelli.
Sure.
You know,
Yes.
I mean, because you get it all. Like murder is good, conspiracies, coup d'états, whatever they have. These
Yeah.
are things you need to do to bring about, to hold on to power.
Mm-hmm.
What interested me as well is that he was never like an emperor. He was never a absolute ruler. He was actually a prefect, I think he was. So like sort of lower level in Florence.
Yeah.
Yeah, like he more of a diplomat. You know, I mean, so that a diplomat would certainly be an important role. You hold power, right? But he was never an absolute ruler. He was never sort of like a president or king.
Right.
But
Yeah.
in his I think it was 14 years I read, 14 years of experience in Florentine government, he was able to whatever hold some power, and in that context, sort of see how power actually works within government.
Right. Yeah. I mean, I guess if he were Prince, probably would have died at some point before he had the
Yeah,
time to write a book.
yeah,
Like, how many princes have written books?
exactly. I mean, I know that. Julius Caesar did, not a prince, but he was a leader, commander, and then also for a time in the transition from the Roman Republic to the Roman Empire, he was part of this triumvirate, which held power. So it was he and two others that held power, and then it transitioned to the empire. He wrote, and every president since for a while in the United States has written their biography after they've left office.
Sure.
Obama's was just released, But
Yeah, but I'm. They weren't like in. I feel like the princes of the day of Machiavelli were like, very ingrained in like the combat. So they had they were much higher risk, especially, and like people were out to get them.
yeah,
Um.
sure,
So yeah, I like
sure,
their life
and
expectancy was
even
lesser.
he was saying, it was toward the end of our reading, about the importance of the prince not to be idle during times of peace, but to
Yep.
be engaged in military activities. So you're sort of always on guard,
Mm-hmm.
always on the ready, you know? Um, right, there's a lot of this that doesn't rest well with me, but then there's a part of it that makes me wonder about how politics actually works. Because, what we have in Plato and Aristotle is that we still have theory. Theory's not bad. Theory's fine. Theory will govern things. Theories can turn into reality, right?
Yep.
Marx's communism turned into a reality, Um, gosh, I forgot the founder of capitalism real quickly. But anyway, that guy who wrote The Wealth of Nations, that turned into a reality. So concepts like theories can become real, but hubris is just it's not there. It's more like, it's the term that's used today about realpolitik, like how the sort of dirty, grimy machinery of politics. And so the reason I raise that is that the theory part really interests me, and I guess not just the theory part, but also the role of virtues. Anyway, I think you could say we found really in Plato, Aristotle, and Augustine, right,
Mm-hmm.
are important. I mean, that he does a reversal on the importance of virtues, like the classical virtues, doesn't sit well. But the flip side is, once you're in, it makes me feel like once the game of politics is being played, maybe it is ugly. Maybe there are things that need to happen that you just wouldn't want to happen, but given the nature of sort of international relations, especially in the 21st century or in the 20th century, with globalism and all these interconnections, maybe there is this sort of politics that kicks in that, well, I'll be bold, has to betray some of those old-fashioned virtues in
Mm-hmm.
order to get stuff done. It's sort of like, I brought up I think I brought up before, how when the most recent Supreme Court justice that was just voted in by the Senate, how it was within a month or so of the election, and 4 years prior, when Obama was in a similar situation, it was well over a month. It was like, maybe, I don't know, 7 months, something like that, or about 7 months or so
Mm-hmm.
before the election. Supreme Court Justice died, Anthony Scalia, and then he proposed a new justice, and the Republican Senate, who was in the majority, just shut him down. They were like, no, a president during an election year should not actually decide on a Supreme Court justice. And they totally shut him. They actually chose one that was a bit moderate.
Mm-hmm.
And then it flipped. In the same Republican Senate, like, no, we're within a month of I'm sorry. They were like, they totally pushed through the candidate for the Supreme Court justice.
Mm-hmm.
And it was like, what the hell? They did a total reversal on the language that they use under Obama that they're using under Trump. It's still an election year, and it's even closer to the election, and they're pushing through a Supreme Court justice.
Mm-hmm.
So, my mind thinks contradiction.
Double standard.
Machiavelli would probably say, no, that's how it works. I mean, it's prediction, in other words, could be part of the game.
Yeah.
And let's just say that I was on the side of the Republicans on this. It'd be the case that I would be like, yeah, I want a Republican conservative Supreme Court justice, and fine. So they change their mind. We're using a double standard, but whatever. I got something out of it. I got what I wanted. So it makes me think this actually sort of how the nature of politics works, whereas theory combined with virtue and maybe basic logic, consistency, um, just it doesn't apply
Well,
because of the messy nature of politics.
I mean, yeah, I think that's pretty obvious. Like the corruption of man is going to cause these things, um, like not just to happen, but like because you're not dealing with theory in the real world, you can't assume that like they'll carry through, right? Like there's nothing to enforce these, is there's nothing to force them to act the same way one year versus the next.
Right.
So they'll act however they want for their interest, or for whatever interest
Hmm.
is
Hmm.
they have or are ascribed to. Um,
Right.
I think that just makes sense. Um, Now the question is, how do you take the theory and how do you take the real world and combine the two? It's like, can you even use the theory to like in the real world? Um, like, is there like how do you determine the best response to the real world?
Hmm.
Um, if you're up against someone who's going to be corrupt, right? Like, do
Yeah.
you have to be corrupt to counteract that?
Right.
Um,
Right.
and I think that's interesting because when we talk about Thrasymachus's um, definition of justice being like power, there's something that feels very hopeless about that, but there's something that's just very true. Like, if you have control over
Yeah.
something, you
Yeah.
have
Yeah.
control over something. If someone has control over you, they have control over you. There's not much you can do about it unless you can overturn that power. Um, and when you're dealing with that in the real world, it's like it's a constant battle between power because you need to have something to back up your position or whatever you're fighting for. And it's really
Yeah.
interesting when you bring that into the context of like governments, because it's like what, like, especially when you're considering citizens, it's like, oh, citizens might just be living their everyday lives, not caring too much about what the government's doing, obeying the justice of the power, um,
Yeah.
and and they might feel safe in that because the government is powerful, right? Like something needs to
Yeah.
be the backbone of the government, and I think that power is kind of the main thing that exists there. Like I don't know if a rich government necessarily with like a rich government that doesn't have power, but then it's like, well, does money equate to power? Um,
Hmm.
like what are the different ways you can kind of have power? And it kind of seems like if you have power over your citizens' human rights, then you can control them to a degree, and then you can um, like I don't know what the right word is. I guess secure the rules that you've come
Right.
up with.
Hmm. Hmm.
Um, so yeah, it's definitely
Yeah.
like something that you have to combat.
Yeah. I think though, like this old saying, right? You have to break eggs to make an omelet, right?
Uh huh.
In other words, like some things you might have to do certain things that you don't want to do, or so there might be um, you might have to there might have to be some destruction in order to create, right?
Mm-hmm.
Something that's positive. The question though is the um, so that I feel like that's the nut that needs to be dealt with Machiavelli.
Mm-hmm.
Like to what degree would we say that is recommended? In other words, like to what degree do we have to do questionable facts in order to bring about a good end, right?
Right.
So, from the Republican perspective, on the case of the Supreme Court justice, okay, so they've got this inconsistency there. Maybe we can overlook the inconsistency because, from their perspective, they brought about a good.
Mm-hmm.
But it's that little area of those steps that you make to bring about that end that raises the question, like what are the limits of that? Like he gave one example where the prince basically got everyone together. It was like noblemen and others, and then had them all killed.
Mm-hmm.
And so therefore he had like there was no opposition, I mean, literally, the opposition was killed.
Yeah,
You
that's yeah.
know, so that's breaking eggs to make your omelet. But you and I would probably say no. I mean, there might be maybe there is a noble lie, but an all out killing of a group of people in order to hold on to your power. And also, too, holding on to your power that's an open term, right?
Hmm.
Because that power could be for good or ill.
Sure.
We
Hmm.
I think you and I wouldn't have a problem if it was you do a couple whatever you have the noble lie to bring about a good thing, but
Yep.
um, but a lot of what he recommends um, seems to go well beyond sort of these low level um, vices.
Yeah. It's very carnal. It's like um and I guess one question is it's like is that the only thing that that can secure your power? Um
Yeah,
or is it just the best way that he finds? Um
yeah,
I have this thought experiment. I don't know if you want to pursue it, but like what if you took um like what if you took Plato and Aristotle's ideal city and you put it in a world where there were princes, like Machiavellian princes. Like
mm-hmm.
how does that like how do you like how does your theoretical city respond to these princes who are, killing for power? Because I mean there was an army in that
Yeah,
ideal city, right? And
mm-hmm.
they
Mm-hmm.
were to protect the city. And there was an aspect of the city
And
that
yeah,
that like the city
and
had
to
to
expand
expand to fit
borders,
the needs of
just
the
to put
people,
that in.
right?
Right, right,
But it wasn't all
right.
about like obtaining more. It wasn't power hungry, right? It was about supporting the people within the city.
No, not at all. In fact, Plato's his first city was not even that. The simple one, right?
Hmm.
The city of pigs, as it were. It was not at all about that. You know, no. It's an interesting thought experiment. I think that or the problem with the Machiavellian prince within Plato's ideal city, is that the 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 intentions seemingly of the prince would betray the good of the whole.
Hmm.
Um, I mean, we'd have to work that out, how it would betray the good of the whole. But in part, there is. I mean, I know that toward the end of our reading, Machiavelli does encourage like. Remember, he basically said, like we said before, during times of peace, you still need to be sort of training yourself in military activities. Don't rest. And then he also says that you need to be a good reader of history to look for these examples to embody. And he looks back to Rome a lot,
Hmm.
which was a bellicose, militaristic um, empire. So he does recommend sort of like training, but the training of the philosopher king in Plato is starkly different,
Right.
right? Um, there's gymnastics that's involved, so there's a military element of physicality and building that up. But then he needs to be in touch with the forms. Hence, I think it was book 5 just sort of dedicated to
Hmm.
explaining sort of the importance of the forms and the importance of sort of this vast grasp of metaphysical knowledge, which does not come up with in the right, or at least yet. But I don't think we're going to see it.
I don't think we're gonna see it.
And no, and then also the idea within the prince is then to hold on to power and to maintain power for as long as possible. Whereas in the and that's I would say that's the higher goal. I think it's fair to say that's the higher goal of the prince.
Right.
Um, whereas in Plato, the higher goal of the city is, and therefore, if you will, of the philosopher king, is to um, to do things to keep all of the tasks in proper place. But that's just a step on the way to maintain order for the good of the whole.
Hmm.
And the good of the whole does not seem to be of interest, right? I mean, let's put it this way, like, it might be the case that the military in the ideal state or the artisans in the ideal state, maybe they want more upward mobility, like we see in the United States, right? Not going to get that with Plato. So that we could say that look at that as or an individual within that state could look at that as a deficit. But at no point is Plato going to recommend killing off people within the regime in order to maintain power.
Right.
You know, I'm trying to think with Aristotle. What you can do with Aristotle is that connecting it to his ethics, or as we talked about, are connected to his politics. So we go back to all these sets of virtues, traditional sort of classical virtues,
Hmm.
and they seem, maybe not all of them, but a lot of them seem to be portrayed. Like I say, not all of them. So, for instance, courage. The importance of courage in Aristotle, one could argue, is also equally important for the prince in Machiavelli. And courage is a virtue, right?
Hmm.
But things like, equanimity, fairness, being magnanimous, but not egotistical. Egotistical being like a vice of excess, right? Would seem to be portrayed in the prince, and also too, the idea within Aristotle is that within his regime is that all of the citizens, all of the citizens are politically active in order to arrive at their own individual virtue and flourishing. And that is, again, that's you're not going to find that in Machiavelli.
Right.
And he does a reversal. I talked to Luca this morning. I was like, there's the Italian word. I'm sorry, Machiavelli wrote in Italian, so he's writing in Italian at this point. As a lot of Renaissance writers did. They went back to the vernacular as opposed to Latin. So I was like, virtue, or I don't know how to say it in Italian, but virtue, I guess. He brings it up in our reading,
Hmm.
but it's not sort of the traditional virtues, more of the manly virtues, the masculine virtues, like sort of like other cognates, like virility or something like that.
Right.
Which is connected back to the Latin word for virtue, but it's not. But he sort of is looking at a slice of it, not the whole spectrum of virtues that you find in Plato and Aristotle. Like for instance, like basic moderation. I don't think you're going to. I would say I think it's fair to say the prince is immoderate.
Hmm.
Is excessive. He does have a notion of virtue, but I feel like it's more along the lines of like sort of Roman militaristic masculinity,
Right.
those forceful pieces of the concept.
I feel like his
Um,
morals are very utilitarian, right?
yes, yes,
Because they're all going back to obtaining power. Like that's the primary goal of what he's
right,
displaying. He's
totally.
not trying to find the mean between two vices. He's not
No,
sticking to one thing. Um, so yeah.
no, I think that's fair.
Hmm.
Um, so it's like, in other words, he has principles. It's just the principles are very different.
Yep.
It's a obviously principles, like anything, he's got to have some guiding principles. He's got them, but they're starkly different from the traditional classical virtues that we've been seeing.
Yeah, it
You
looks
know.
like we're gonna get them in the next few chapters, um, more
Mhm.
specifically.
What did you think of the Moses reference
Um,
in book 13?
right.
No, that was the David reference. Sorry, that was interesting.
That was interesting, though.
It's book 6, actually. 6, I think. Yeah,
Yeah,
book
yeah,
6.
yeah. Um,
He's like, those who became princes by their own abilities and not by good fortune. I say the most outstanding are Moses, Cyrus, Romulus, Theseus, and others like them. Um,
um,
Fortune, as it were, provided the matter. They gave it its form. Without opportunity, their prowess would have been extinguished. And without such prowess, opportunity would have come in vain. Thus, for the Israelites to be ready to follow Moses in order to escape from servitude, it was necessary for him to find them in Egypt, enslaved and oppressed by the Egyptians. So you've got the opportunity there for to become a prince, as
right,
it
to
were.
revolt. Yeah. Um, hmm. I mean, the comparisons seem pretty apt. Like, each of them is taking, a group from within an existing structure and raising its power beyond that, right?
Right, right.
Um, so, I mean, they're comparing it to Moses. Now, I think that the the morals or the reasons behind each of these is different,
Mhm.
right?
Right,
Like,
right. Oh, totally.
yeah, like Moses is being instructed by God, which he mentions, and he mentions what he says. Yeah, he merely executed what God commanded. Yet he must be praised for the
Right,
grace which made him worthy of speaking with God. Um,
right,
right. Which is different than the other examples because
right.
um,
God is not is
he's
not
yeah
relative
he's not
there.
there, and I don't even know if they necessarily have a teacher. I'm not very
Right,
familiar with their situations though.
right.
So like in other
I'm
words,
most familiar with Rom.
their morals are
Go
kind
ahead.
of they are coming from themselves, right?
Mhm.
As opposed to from God.
Right. And I think probably what he's going to do is I wonder if he's going to be a little bit more sort of reductionistic in the Moses story, right? So
Hmm.
they're like, yeah, there's the God concept, and there's sort of the um, whatever God sort of you know commanding and or ushering Moses forth and all that. But I wonder if he's going to be a little bit more sort of materialistic and just be like, hey, fine, there's that. But the reality is, um, look what the circumstance was.
Hmm.
You had people that were enslaved, and people that are enslaved want to be liberated, and there's your opportunity. So,
Right. Hmm.
and you know,
So it's
and
not
and
even
for him,
so it's not even like, oh, it's right, I'm going to make a comparison to how we were talking about the interest of the people versus the interest of the leader. It's not even that he's
sure,
doing it because it's the interest of the people. From like the way that Machiavelli might interpret it is like, oh, the opportunity is there are people who want to be free, and it's a majority, like it's a good portion of people, so I can take advantage of that and then capitalize
exactly,
off of that situation.
exactly. I
Hmm.
mean, I think what is interesting is this element of opportunity. I mean, he doesn't just say it's prowess, right? It's not just power. It's not just sort of like drive and ambition.
Right.
I think he's relatively smart um, in this observation. Out, um, and we could probably look at a lot of examples, right, throughout history, even
Hmm.
recent history. Like Obama comes to mind, right? You've got 8 years of a Democrat. I'm sorry, 8 years of a Republican, George W. Bush. Um, a lot of Democrats and other radicals took issue with him on a number of fronts, specifically the treatment of prisoners in Guantanamo Bay. and other issues, let's say. And not only that, you have opportunity here in the sense that there has not been um, a black president.
Mm-hmm.
We just haven't had it, you know. And here he is. He's young. He's articulate. He's rising in the ranks in the DNC. Right. He gave an important speech at the convention for during the 2004 election, um, and and there's sort of this moment. You know, it's right after 8 years of the Republican president, and I mean, as I'm sure you've seen, there's sort of this pendulum swing, right?
Right.
Where sort of Democrat serves and Republican serves, and so there's the opening for the Democrats, and against John McCain, who ended up becoming good friends with later, but sort of older, not as sort of young, and not with the same charisma. And there's your opportunity. You sort of put all those together. It's not that this man is just great. It's that this is his time, as it were.
Right. Mm-hmm.
Because all the pieces are in pieces for it to happen. So I did find that to be really attractive. Not the element of take advantage of the opportunity to gain power, but more like realizing that that opportunity helps. It aids the ability to rise in the ranks.
Right. I mean, it makes it easier.
Yeah. Yeah. Yeah.
It's a strategic play.
Right. Is Machiavelli, you know?
Mm-hmm.
I think with all the chess I've been playing lately, and then reading this, I'm like, oh my god! It's like he would have been great at chess, you know?
Right.
I wonder if he was.
Right.
So, let me ask you this in conclusion. How, we spent, what, 3-4 weeks on Augustine? How did this reading, following on the heels of Augustine, what did it do to you as a reader? Also, realizing that you, given your religious beliefs, siding a little bit more with Augustine, how did you experience the Prince as a reader?
Mm-hmm. So first comparison, I think his writing style in like how he breaks. Maybe it's I don't know if it's the same period of time, but like the way that he writes, he has like these short chapters, which is very similar to the way Augustine did, as opposed to
Mm-hmm.
Aristotle or Plato. So
Sure.
that was something I noticed that was similar. He also ties in a bunch of historic events like uh, St. Augustine did.
Yeah.
So
Mm-hmm.
their writing is a lot more empirical, um,
Certainly.
which, yeah, so that's kind of how I
That's a,
compared it.
that's a, that's a good that's a good similarity. Good for you.
Yeah. Um, from more of a content point of view, so it's still a very logical way of going about things, although
Sure.
I feel like it's not fully grounded.
Yeah.
It's not like, oh, this there's premises and conclusions. It's more of like I'm extracting this data. This is how you do it. This is how you want to do it. Because that's just how it works, or that's how it's worked in these specific instances. So it's very empirical in that sense.
Correct.
But there is logic tied into it. I think from the way that I've grasped it, um, I don't necessarily disagree with the things he's saying, which might sound weird, but that's kind of just because
No.
I understand it from his point of view. Um,
Sure.
right? Like, I don't
No, that's
necessarily
valid.
agree that these are all the right courses of action to take, but I
In
understand
other words,
how, like, where he's coming from.
right. In other words, like from this premise,
Yeah,
which is really questionable, I get how the conclusions that follow.
right. Um, yeah, like, I think there are certain things that you could extract that are um, good or could lead to wisdom, like knowing how opportunities work is definitely important. Like you can't just have some sort of effort and try to bring it about in a situation where you're going against the grain the whole time. Um,
Right.
if you find opportunities, then taking advantage of them will help your efforts. The question is, are your efforts the right thing to do? Um,
Right.
I think there's a very Aristotelian
Hmm.
way of going about things where if it is a mean between two vices, um,
Right.
then doing some of the things that he's talking about might make sense.
Yeah.
Yeah.
For me, I would put him squarely, and you wouldn't disagree with this, but I would put him squarely in the city of man.
Yeah.
He seems to be. He almost. That's why it's almost interesting reading it right after Augustine, because it's like the embodiment
Yeah.
of the city of
Mm-hmm.
man. And um, and I would agree with the other observations too. Especially, they both do a lot of focusing on Rome. I mean, obviously Augustine, that makes sense because he's living it,
Mm-hmm.
and then um, Machiavelli is hundreds of years later, but it's still sort of relevant for him. Um, and yeah, just the exact opposite of all of the traits of the city of God
Yep.
as he portrays it. Um, so yeah, and it'll be interesting to see how it unfolds. The one thing I was going to say is that sometimes this is so I've read considered the one of the first works of modern political theory because it looks so much like how modern nation states operate.
Mm-hmm.
Um, and actually, sometimes, certainly from his time on, even things like coup d'états. I mean that's something that still happens
Right.
in other parts of the world.
Mm-hmm.
You know, um, so and you wonder to what extent. I mean, I'm sure a lot of politicians, at least as they've gone to their prep schools and elite universities, have read him, but I wonder how many really quite agree with him. Um,
Right.
given how politics works. Um, but I'll say, I mean, there's still this element of, and I don't know if it's my upbringing or what, that I'd rather have, the, a politician or a leader, a prince, whatever you call it, that will operate by accepted rules of logic,
Mm-hmm.
virtues that, uh, um, are humane, at minimum, meaning like you can have spiritual ones or religious ones as well, but just at minimum humane.
Sure.
And and when I see a politician sort of step out on those principles, I admire him or her.
Mm-hmm.
Like I think like Senator Romney, so Republican, he has stood up against sort of Trump and sort of Trump followers within the Senate. And it's not just going to be sort of a yes man to everything that the president says or does.
Right.
And like that's good. That's because one, he's not just sort of playing this like party politics. Like I'm this party, therefore, my leader's this party. Whatever he says goes. It's just there's no way that you could do a flip of this as well. Whatever under Obama, was there a Democrat that disagreed with X, Y, or Z?
Mm-hmm.
I admire that because I feel like they're being a little bit more authentic
Yeah.
as at least themselves,
Mm-hmm.
as opposed to just it's like I often compare it to like um, uh, sports, right? This is my team. I want them to win,
Right.
and all the other
Mm-hmm.
teams evil, like Ravens versus Steelers or something. It's just like it's like to run. I mean, it's fine if you do sports that way because it's generally benign. It's entertainment. But to run politics that way, which has real world ramifications for all sorts of citizens, I think is problematic.
Yeah. No, I
It's not just about
agree.
the team winning. It's, this is old fashioned. but sometimes it's about doing the right thing,
Mm-hmm.
and that might be separating yourself from the party.
Yeah.
You know.
I imagine we'll get more into the weeds on this topic as we get more into identity politics. Um,
Yeah.
there's one other thing I wanted to mention from what we just read, though, and that was with the military. Um,
Mm-hmm.
that I really liked. So basically, in short, don't don't like use native troops. Use troops that belong
Right.
to you or have your
That
kind
was
of
interesting.
ideals. Um, and it makes sense because it's like, well, you have the potential of rebellion if you use alien troops as they worded it, as he worded it.
Sure.
Of course, like there's an interesting dynamic where it's like you want to gain trust of those quote unquote alien people so that maybe they can assimilate at some point in time. But it's like you gotta do it your way. You gotta trust what you know in order
Right.
for it to work.
No, I thought those parts were really interesting. I didn't know where they were going to go. And I think what's interesting is that like the mercenary, his point about the mercenary armies, that sort of makes sense, right?
Mm-hmm.
You know, hired, sort of a hired army. And where are your loyalties? Your loyalties are more with the money than it is with the national cause
Right. Mm-hmm.
that you're fighting for. But the auxiliary one, I didn't necessarily agree with because it might have been true for him within the space of what he understood in the 15th century, but looking at the world wars and especially the Second World War, that was huge. Like it had to be an Allied effort
Right.
down
Mm-hmm.
the Nazis and take down Hitler, and so I mean, again, whatever if it's Britain helping out the United States or vice versa. Yeah, I mean, I don't know. I feel like the goal can be the same, and you can be as passionate about it, even though you are not. If you're British, you're not American, or if you're American, you're not British. You know what I'm saying? Like the
Yeah.
goal
Yeah.
of 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 quashing that evil, I think, can be a driving factor.
So
Um, and then let me just add one more thing.
yeah.
And then there's also the question of those times when a smaller country needs the help of a larger country.
Mm-hmm.
So that's going to be in his auxiliary camp as well. You know.
Right. Yeah.
Oh,
Um, I think the example of the world wars is very different because
sure.
there is like this hugely common goal, right? There's this large threat. You kind of you like you said you need the allies to work together. Whereas like if you're dealing with smaller like states or provinces where they're just trying to conquer another one and they need the help like if one state um, needs the help of another state to conquer this land, but the one state
Mm-hmm.
doesn't necessarily have an issue with it. They're just doing it because they have their allies. Um,
Right.
like I feel like there's a difference in circumstances there. Almost like the auxiliary is mercenary or paid for, right?
Right.
Um,
Right.
so
No,
and yeah, I don't know. It's different. Like I'm not too familiar with historical examples that I can point to, but I imagine there are examples where you've had allied states go against another state, and then the one like you have to divide up. You have to decide what you're going to do afterwards, right? Like who's going to get the land, or are you dividing it, or those kinds of terms. And I guess if those are foggy, then they might turn on you and take that land,
yeah. No, I could see that. I
right?
could totally see that. I'm wondering if uh, there's any, there's any, um, yeah, no. I'm wondering if there's any historical examples that sort of, act, you
Hmm.
know, um, Uh, yeah, I'd have to think about that. My grasp of military history is not that great.
Right.
But so, all right, man, we should probably wrap up here.
Mm-hmm.
Good talk. Good talk.
Yeah.
And we will obviously do it next week. Are we off recording now?